And now we turn to our next speaker, Diane Potts from Lancaster University Linguistics Department. And I'm looking at Diane's bio and her webpage, and Diane really seems to embody what we are trying to do here, which is bring together language education and science education. And I can see that Diane has developed a very strong research profile in multilingualism, the teaching of English as an additional language, multimodality, and in her teaching and research, she's worked on the ways in which science and languages come together. And in particular, some of her research areas that are very interesting for us are digital language learning, digital literacies, computer-mediated communication. So we can see the STEM aspect, dimension of Diane's language research is very strong. And today, Diane is going to talk about languages, sciences, and the university as catalyst. So over to you, Diane.
All right. How are we doing for sound? Okay. First, I want to thank Derek and Tim for inviting me. It was an honor. It was fun to look at what people were doing and to see what I might be part of. This presentation is a bit different what I would typically do in reporting out my research, because it is a continuation of the conversation that Tim and I had well over a year ago in the market garden about language and science, and I framed it that way. I'm also going to be a good scientist and talk about failure. I'm a great believer that we should talk about failure because that's what we learn from. And there's a bias we know in academia to talk about, I have to move the mic, guys, sorry, once I find it. There? Better? Got it. Yes, Pottses have big voices. There's a bias to reporting on successes. And yet by reporting on successes, we lose an opportunity to learn. So I am deliberately taking advantage of a story that I can tell that can be packaged as a success, but I prefer to discuss it as a failure. And McWhorter helps me out. So some of you who are linguists will know who John McWhorter is. He's at Columbia University, and he has a column in the New York Times on a weekly basis. So he's quite distinguished. And this is from Tuesday. And he was writing about digital translation, both in writing but also in audio, and whether people are going to learn languages. This is the concluding paragraph of his editorial. This is the only slide I will read out. Learning to genuinely speak a new language will hardly be unknown. He's talking about the future. It will continue to beckon, for instance, for those actually relocating to a new country. Well, I might dispute that as a Canadian. And it will persist with people who want to engage with literature or media in the original language, as well as those of us who find pleasure in mastering new codes just because they are there. And that made me think of Tim as soon as I read it. In other words, it will likely become an artisan pursuit of interest to a much smaller but more committed set of enthusiasts. And weird as that is, it is in its way a kind of progress. So that's McWhorter on Tuesday. And McWhorter has power, and this is the New York Times. And it sits in almost direct opposition to everything that has been said at this conference. And one of the things to point out is that he's making reference to media and literature, and there is no place for science in what he is saying. That frames this talk, and I'm going to continue to frame this talk with a bit of literature that I think is relevant to what we're doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about knowledge, collaboration, and power, and a particular collaboration with a primary school here in Lancaster, Matters Arising. And I want to go back to this issue of transversals. And somebody yesterday was speaking about transversals. I am going to make some assumptions. I'm going to make the assumption that we are all talking about languages. If we look at current research in applied linguistics, there's a debate, is multilingualism a characteristic of a community or of an individual? We have the EU concept of plurilingual. We have the ideas of translanguaging, which the last time I went to the American Association of Applied Linguists, the presenters were talking about 16 definitions of translanguaging. We have a number of ways in which people are looking to reframe what counts as a language. I'm going to assume that everyone today is making it a countable noun. I'm going to assume that all of us support languages. So I'm not going to make the argument for languages. I think that's been many, many times over. And I also want to speak from a position of critical humility. And I had to think about how I was going to frame that. But there is the fact that we know some things, but we don't know everything. And what any one of us knows is a small piece of what is known. And that the problems and the challenges and the opportunities of working with languages are big across all of those. And that there is both the need to be humble and to critically evaluate our position of humility to strengthen our arguments. I'm going to assume that's something that we all share, is that orientation. So, transversals, barriers, and boundaries. There are two dominant concepts of transversals at play right now in the academic literature and in the policy literature, and they are in almost direct opposition. We have the concept of transversal that was put forward by UNESCO, that's embedded in a number of EU documents. Transversals are those things we learn that are not specific, for example, to a technical piece of knowledge or to a discipline. They are the things that transverse across, and they are communication skills. So that was why languages often come up. They are the interpersonal and the social and emotional intelligences. And so that's why they're often discussed in relation to language learning. And if one looks at how these discussions are evolving, it looks a lot like the discussions that followed lifelong learning, which in 1971 was very much about self-actualization and then became an economic variable and now gets hotly debated. And it does seem that this debate about transversals is following the same. But then we have the concept of transversal that is put forward by the Global South, and primarily coming out of South America. Anyone who is doing work on decolonization will recognize the name of De Sousa Santos. And this is not a linguistic theory, but this is the idea that we are separate, that we need to transverse. This is the idea that we do learn more about ourselves by attempting to reach across, that I can never fully understand you, but I understand me more by being part of that attempt to bridge. The Council of Europe concept, if we use that, it is about the mobility of the person, me as an economic unit and a knowledge unit. The concept coming out of the Global South is about the mobility of knowledge. There are commonalities between these two, although they are in some ways oppositional, and that is that they are about knowledge. If we're being generous, it's about whose knowledge counts and being able to bring one's knowledge to bear in any given context. Issues of crossing, combining, remaking, fusing, and learning, lots of different verbs, lots of different processes. But that's what these conversations about transversals discuss, and how they are being discussed in the context of language and economics and business. But what I want to make clear then from the perspective of this presentation is that we're talking about language as meaning. And I can talk about how grammar contributes to meaning, and I can talk about how syntax contributes to meaning, but let's squarely place this presentation on meaning. Some of you will know Holliday and Martin's seminal book from 1993 on writing science. If you don't know it and you're interested in language and science, it's worth a read, because the first chapter talks about the coevolution of the European languages and science, the Renaissance. It talks about how language had to change in order to do science the way we do science. But then as language changed, we did science differently. We thought differently because we had different tools for thinking. And the tool there is a Vygotskian understanding of tool, a mediation device. Right? And they trace those evolutions in that period of time. This is also when some of the seminal work was being done on scientific genres. And they make the common sense point that if you put a 10-year-old in front of a book, they'll tell you if it's a science book. They know it's a science book, not because of the topic, but because of how it's written. They don't need a teacher to tell them that. They may not be able to parse what makes it science, but they recognize it as science. And we have pedagogies for language and science, language and content, with very detailed grammatical and lexical descriptions that go back for more than 40 years. And how to teach that, and how to teach it to someone who is learning in an additional language, how to teach it in multiple languages, how to teach it translanguaging. We have lots of stuff. What's interesting is how our knowledge of that stuff does not necessarily circulate well into different spaces. But what I also want to point out here was Holliday's point at the end of his last chapter that he wrote independently, where he talks about scientific language in Chinese. And those of you who know Holliday, who actually, it wasn't Do Coyle who said language for learning, language about learning, whatever, that was Holliday. That's Coyle using Holliday. The point he was making is that these, and they were explicit discussions about language and science, were because of the struggle to put into English and French what was going on. And then the Chinese, as a language that is used, that's what I mean by Chinese here, not Chinese national, but a language that is being used, when they were taking up the scientific concepts, looked at how to do that in Chinese. But if you go further back, of course, the Chinese were far more technically advanced than the Europeans. And there are concepts that developed in Chinese. And the argument he makes is the need to, it would be useful to trace how the languages were changing and what that meant, what got noticed and what didn't, how we classify, how we understand dynamics. And that leads nicely to the work of Marie Baptiste, who is an Indigenous scholar in Canada and who started a module on decolonizing education in 1995, in case any of us are silly enough to think that that decolonization is new, 30 years. And she makes the point here, and it's critical to understanding science, that the point about Indigenous languages is not to learn the Indigenous language. It is the epistemologies and ontologies of the Indigenous science. And that if you're just learning the language, you're not actually learning the language. That you need to be learning science in the language because that's the only way you're going to understand the language, these worldviews. And if you were in Canada, there are university courses on Indigenous science that have existed for more than 20 years, and it's not unusual nowadays for children to study Indigenous sciences in the units. But one needs the language to understand the scientific relations, and you need someone who can work that language to help you truly understand. This is the point Baptiste is making. There's outstanding work coming out of South Africa now. You know, we have a tendency to default to the North American or the European work. There is outstanding work pointing also to the power dynamics of nations where there are 12 official languages, but they do not have the same status. If you want to see a fantastic dictionary, look at the Trilingual Dictionary of CAPS, which is a community effort, a documenting of that language. Sometimes bringing in the Indigenous language or the less powerful languages to learn the dominant science, sometimes using those languages for the science that those languages know. And that is being done in multiple places. Some of it, and actually a lot of it linking to Christian citizenship, which is still unrefined and critiqued, but worth looking at. And one could also look at the work in New Zealand around the Maori people, what constitutions and laws and treaties have allowed to take root in those settings on the periphery. Belgian scholars, though, and I prefer to foreground those that not everybody else cites, which I think is critical in this kind of work, pointing out that we have this imagined potential of multilingualism, what could happen in our classrooms. But I would love to ask each of you in your classrooms how many times your instructors at any level of education have structured activities that lead you to draw out your languages, to use your languages and linguistic resources in ways that benefit all. Those practices are there. How frequently are we engaging with them? If you go and walk the streets of Lancaster, you will hear languages now. And you will hear languages from many different contexts. You know, it's no longer the stereotype of European languages. If you go into classrooms in Lancaster and Morecambe, you will hear English. So we got a problem. Now we can talk about the constraints of the English education system in particular, about there being statutory requirements for teaching particular grammatical forms in primary school. They are statutory requirements. We can talk about the kinds of knowledge points, the way the curriculum is defined. There are impediments, but none of these are impossibles. And so, in term one of last year, through a relationship that developed during COVID and some work that the university was doing to support primary schools, engaged with a Catholic primary that is also the sanctuary school. That is, they are the school that is identified as welcoming refugees. And so you know there's going to be linguistic diversity there and of different kinds of diversity. And said, basically, hey, would you like to do something with languages? And hey, would you like to do something with languages and science? Because personally, I think the easiest way to teach a language is with science. And I could talk about why I think that. This is an exceptional school as well in that there's about 3% of schools in England that have this primary science quality mark. That is, the quality of their science instruction is superb. Their head was a science major. Their deputy head has a PhD in bioscience, I think. So, but that's actually not their mover and shaker on getting that mark. So there's a real commitment to teaching science well, not just teaching science for the test. The other thing, though, that we wanted to do, sorry, that is me in the mic. The other thing we wanted to do, though, was remake the relationship. Because much of our engagement work is the university saying, hey, have I got a deal for you? Here is the checklist of what we're going to offer. Here's when we're offering it. When would you like to come up? How would you like to do it? But actually, it's already packaged, and it's wrapped in cellophane, and it's going to be this way. If we're talking about transversals and power and knowledge, then our work with schools is as a peer. It's recognizing the expertise they bring and collaborating in the design of how we do this. And so part of this attempt was saying, let's see if we can redo the relations at the same time as we're redoing the science. They knew most of the kids in their classrooms would have languages. It was pretty much 100% in both year 3 and year 6. They didn't know that. And at least kids were at least saying, I know some Spanish from Spanish holidays going to Spain. Every kid wanted to claim some knowledge of language. And there were refugees. And there were 1 or 2 kids who were the children of PhD students. And there was an interesting diversity. So what did we do in the term 3 of the previous year? Initial planning sessions with the head, then sat down with the teachers. Then we finalized our university resources, which is going to become the headache. This was done in June. Project was to start end of September. And we were told, you want physics students. These are going to be the students you want because we want to study light. Light appears in year 3 and year 6 in the curriculum, and light in the curriculum looks exactly like what I studied in year 3 and year 6. It has not changed, and that's terrifying because I'm old and children should not be studying what I studied in year 3 and year 6 in science. So planning, and here's what we talked about doing and did to some extent. So with the year 3s, it's all about shadows. That's conceptually to understand that the shadow is in the shape of the thing that is blocking the light. There's, how it refracts, bends. There's some basic things you learn. We wanted to use the arts and the sciences, so they do folk tales in year 3. This is resized badly, apologies, because it comes from Keynote. What's the difference between reading a fable and performing a fable? We invited them to bring fables in their languages, and then the idea was that they would perform them using shadow puppetry in the languages of their choice. And of course, if you're doing poetry, that's a reduced linguistic load. And so for children who may not be as fluent in their additional languages, they can use other semiotic resources to tell the story. Year 6, we upped it a bit. Year 6 in the curriculum says review. Review? I think not. So we wanted to use what was going on with the James Webb telescope and expand the conceptions of what their understandings of what light was doing. And if I want to tell the success story, I would show you the video of the students doing shadow puppetry, explaining concepts of light, this is year 6, in multiple languages. If I wanted to tell the happy story. But I don't want to tell the happy story. I want to tell the story about this. Working with the physics students, working then with a community artist. This is relatively low cost. And then the idea that the students would share in a diverse range of languages. And I call this matters arising, as one would if one was in a meeting. And I'm using here the notes, my dictated notes each evening, and those of a PhD student of mine who assisted, who also has an interest in equity and languages. I want you to imagine that it is bucketing rain, like not a normal Lancaster shower, but it is bucketing rain. And we had a plan from June to bring these kids up, excuse the kids, some people don't like that, to bring the children up to the university. The physics students were sometimes in the school, sometimes at the university. And we picked when we knew there were rooms. And I want you to imagine it's lunch and it's bucketing and we're over in George Fox. George Fox is the older one, Charles Carter is the new one. We're over in George Fox and the kids have been incredibly polite and they've eaten lunch, but we've got 20 or some minutes. We still want to let them play. And a physics student and I had the bright idea. I said, can you do this? He said, yeah. And we turn on the projector and imagine 20-some 8-year-olds doing shadow puppets with a lot of maps simultaneously, completely flow. Like if you know the concept of flow, there was flow and understanding how you change. Now, not enough explicit science teaching for that to matter, but thinking about then how you could never do that in a primary school in this town because the rooms are too small. You could never do that pedagogically. I use that as a starting point to talk about time and space and control of space because we do need to think about the physical layout of the classroom. But if I have more gray hair than I did before, it was because of room booking. Because they would not allow us to book rooms until 3 days in advance. And the schools have to book coaches. And the price goes up if you book your coach later. And the whole project becomes less feasible because you can't book the coach because you don't know if you've got a room. We booked the coach anyway. George, whichever one's the new, Charles Carter's the new one. So you have to imagine that they didn't let us book till a couple of days in advance. It's bucketing rain. These kids did fantastic work in the morning. I was with the 8-year-olds. We let them play tag in the atrium. Imagine 26 8-year-olds playing tag in the atrium and how noisy it is. There was no one else in the building, but we couldn't book the room. There was any number of things that go with this in terms of time periods. When is school on? When is school not on? When does our year fit? What's their year? When does that suit them to do the work in comparison when we are willing to be available for planning, for organizing, for any of those things? Term breaks. All of these things were impacting our ability to draw attention to languages and to engage with languages and science in rich ways. To use a beautiful example, think about how many email you got for this conference this week. That is not the planning horizon of a primary school. The planning horizon of a primary school is 3 months in advance. They can't cope with that. There's nothing wrong with it, but whose way of doing things is it? And what then does that mean in terms of the university's catalyst? The physics students. We were told that physics students were great at working with the kids. This is not to blame the physics students. The physics students kept wanting to do science the way they had been taught science, which meant they lectured. They used big words and went here. And we would work in terms of developing a pedagogy, and then they'd get on WhatsApp after our meetings ended and come in the morning of a session and say, we've changed our minds. And we'd be going, how? And what they really wanted to do was cool things. And they had a lot of cool things to show kids, but no science, because the explanations were not accessible. The pedagogy was not accessible. The language was not accessible. And they certainly were not going to be able to move those concepts into their additional language to share with parents. That was also some gray hair. What kept happening repeatedly, and these are my notes to myself, is these children are primed to learn science, and they were primed to use their languages. They were working hard, and the teachers were working hard to make it work. And the university was not working hard. The university was doing its thing, and I will be the stand-in for the university here, doing its thing in terms of time and space and language and practice, and getting in the way of the objectives. Now, I'm telling the failure. The head and the deputy head laugh at me because I think this is one of the worst delivered programs I've ever done in my life. And they keep looking at me and saying, it's not that bad. When they look at the science results for the end of the year, especially with the year sixes, they have technical details that they've never seen in year-end science reviews. The fact we were talking about languages created a shift in the school. They are interested in integrating language into their curriculum across grade levels as a result of doing this. And they have a lovely critique, which they said they had never thought of before, in terms of how when they go to the university, things are organized, and what we were trying to do in terms of a different set of social relations. They notice things they didn't notice before. But man, did those teachers work to save this. Because I don't think we deserve credit. At the same time, and this, I'll skip the artist because I know we're tight on time. Oh no, because that is the science. Sarah commented, I didn't, on the collaborative spirit and the fact that we would invite teachers to collaborate and they would say, what do you want us to do? We talk about being socialized in and through language. And we have socialized the teachers to ask, how high should we jump? And so actually the collaboration was undermined in part because of the assumed roles in the collaboration, with them expecting that they were to do what we said. And that was part of what we were undoing in the process. So for Sarah, who was sort of new to those dynamics, that was frustrating, that she would say to the deputy head, what would you like us to do? And he'd say, well, just tell us what you need. And that conversation was repeated many times unproductively. In the children's plurilingual resources, which is how I would frame this, they're there. There are things that we did. But having been in classrooms where I've worked with teachers to design plurilingual activities, raise the consciousness around languages, if we want to say consciousness, but also get kids using languages not only to their own benefit, but to the collective benefit, this one didn't hit the mark. And I think Transversals is a good way of speaking about that. And this goes to, it was Derek who made a comment about power. The asymmetries of crossing divides. I could draw on social semiotics and SFL to talk about that, but there were, and this goes to De Sousa Santos, and the idea of transversal says we're reaching across, trying to make sense with each other. But of course, not everyone's fully extended here. Some are like this and some are like this, to use gesture, as we were talking about gesture. And the need to recognize how power is playing out in the ways that we stretch across. That it is often invisible, but it was space. The teachers could talk about how bathrooms are organized now and noticing differences, and how knowledge was organized for the children. But these are habits of mind and ways of being that are themselves what need to be critically engaged with if we actually are going to advance what we're talking about, which is both the recognition and effective use of languages for our collective gain. Because in Indigenous science, Canada's benefiting. And you could look at how they're dealing with fires in Canada and what the Indigenous peoples have contributed to the understanding of the fires in the boreal forest right now and where it's ahead. Challenges are multiple, situated, and specific. Even when the divides, when we're trying. There's a lot of work to the trying. But I don't know how we do better if we can't say we failed. If everything has to be wonderful and fantastic and success and accountable and count one, count two, if it has to be those things, how do we get better? And so there are a number of discursive challenges to advancing this kind of work in this particular context. But there are green shoots, as the head and the deputy head point out, and in their willingness to continue to work and reimagine how languages fit in their school. I think we need to take McWhorter seriously. I think we need to show him that he's wrong. I think we need to be able to make it clear how he's wrong and that language is not about literature or media, but it is much more important than just the arts, which is not to say the arts aren't important. But if we box language over there, we're missing out. And people are missing out. And communities are missing out. But we shouldn't underestimate how much work there is to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Diane.